My dad borrowed $200K and called it family duty. The contract said otherwise. It wasn't even his money, not entirely. It was the seed money for the business he'd always dreamed of, the one he pitched to us, his 4 kids, like it was some grand crusade. He sat us down in the mahogany-paneled study, the one with the faded leather chairs that smelled perpetually of old paper and ambition, and he laid it all out. The market was ripe, the concept was bulletproof, and all he needed was a little bridge financing. That was the euphemism he used. Just a bridge, he'd said, a twinkle in his eye, the same one he used when he was about to pull a fast one, though we were too young, too naive to see it then. I was 24, fresh out of business school, convinced I was on the cusp of changing the world, or at least my corner of it. My older brother, Mark, was already managing a portfolio for our father's firm. Sarah, my sister, was deep in her art history phase, dreaming of New York galleries. And then there was little Mikey, still in college, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of desperation that always seemed to swirl around Dad's grand plans. He told us it was an investment, of course, a way for us to get in on the ground floor of something big. He projected triple-digit returns within 5 years. He even had charts, beautifully rendered spreadsheets showing exponential growth, market penetration, all the buzzwords that made a fresh MBA like me nod along, impressed. He framed it as a family affair, a legacy. "This is for all of us," he declared, his voice booming with that characteristic self-importance, "a way to ensure our future, together." We were a tight-knit family, or so we thought. Holiday dinners were elaborate affairs at our sprawling estate in the Hamptons, the kind where you could get lost in the hallways. Summer barbecues on the sprawling lawn overlooking the Sound felt like scenes from a movie. Dad was the patriarch, the alpha, the one who built it all. Mom, elegant and always perfectly poised, was the quiet force behind him, the one who managed the social calendar and ensured the family name remained untarnished. The $200,000 wasn't exactly pocket change for any of us, but it was within reach. Mark liquidated some investments. Sarah cashed in a couple of her more valuable pieces of jewelry. I took out a significant chunk from my savings, supplemented by a small loan I was able to secure based on my future earning potential. Mikey, bless his heart, borrowed from our parents, which essentially meant Dad was shuffling money around, creating the illusion of family participation. He presented it like a venture capitalist pitch, complete with term sheets and projected cash flows. He was so convincing, so passionate. He made it sound like we were all signing up for the same adventure. And in a way, we were. The initial phase was all excitement. Dad was energized, spending weeks at the new office, a rented space in a less than glamorous part of town, a stark contrast to his usual polished world. He'd call with updates, always framed with boundless optimism. "The prototype is looking incredible," he'd say. "We're ahead of schedule, ahead of budget." We'd hear about potential investors, about breakthroughs in development. It felt good, contributing to something tangible, something our father was pouring his soul into. We were all invested, literally and figuratively. We'd talk about what we'd do with our share when it paid off. Mark envisioned expanding his own firm. Sarah dreamed of opening her own gallery, funded by her entrepreneurial success. I was already mentally sketching out plans for my own startup, leveraging the knowledge and capital I'd gain. But then things started to shift, subtly at first. The calls became less frequent, and when they did come, the enthusiasm felt a little forced. The updates became vaguer. He'd talk about market adjustments and regulatory hurdles. When we asked for more detailed financial reports, he'd brush it off, saying it was too complex for us to understand, that we should just trust him. Trust him. The word hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken expectation. The first real crack appeared at Christmas that year. It was supposed to be a celebration of our collective venture, a toast to our future. But Dad seemed off. He'd had a few too many whiskeys, and the mask of jovial patriarch slipped. He started talking about unforeseen expenditures, about investments that weren't panning out as expected. He kept glancing at Mark, a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher in his eyes. Then it spilled out, not in a confession, but in a rambling, slurred accusation. "This whole thing, it's not what it seems," he'd muttered, staring into his drink. I had to cover something else, something much bigger." We were all silent, the clatter of silverware suddenly deafening. Mom, ever the diplomat, jumped in, changing the subject with forced cheerfulness. But the seed of doubt had been sown. Later, Mark cornered me. He'd always been the pragmatic one, the numbers guy. He'd done his own digging, discreetly, of course. He showed me a copy of the original agreement, the one Dad had rushed us through. It wasn't just an investment. It was a loan with a disturbingly high interest rate, and more importantly, a clause that gave Dad significant control over any profits, and more ominously, the principal itself, under certain conditions. The bridge financing was a facade. He hadn't borrowed money from us, he'd borrowed our money, using it as collateral for his own mounting debts. The $200,000 was a drop in the ocean of what he was actually juggling. He was drowning, and he'd pulled us all down with him. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The humiliation was immediate and searing.
We, his children, were not partners in his grand scheme. We were unwitting financiers, pawns in a game he was losing. The contract, which we'd signed without truly reading, without demanding independent counsel, was a testament to our blind faith, our childish belief in his infallibility. The family duty he'd invoked was a lie, a manipulation to secure funds he desperately needed, not for a dream business, but to shore up his own crumbling empire, likely due to other, riskier ventures we knew nothing about. The next few months were a blur of quiet desperation. Dad became increasingly evasive. He'd cancel meetings, cite confidential negotiations, and generally shut us out. When we pressed him, his temper would flare. He'd accuse us of not understanding the pressures of business, of being unsupportive. He'd even use the phrase, "You don't know what it takes to build an empire. You're just children playing at business." The sting of those words, coming from the man who supposedly championed our entrepreneurial spirits, was profound. The humiliation wasn't just about the money. It was about the betrayal of our trust, the perversion of his paternal role. He had used our youthful idealism and our familial bonds as leverage, and now he was actively avoiding the consequences. One evening, I found myself at his study again, this time alone. The mahogany felt oppressive, the faded leather chairs like silent witnesses. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for proof. I opened drawers, rifled through cabinets, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a growing cold anger. And then I found it. Tucked away in a false bottom of an old cigar humidor, a ledger. Not the slick professional spreadsheets Dad had shown us, but a handwritten, dog-eared book. It detailed payments, dates, names I didn't recognize. And then there it was, a section labeled Family Fund. Underneath, entries that clearly showed him siphoning money out, diverting it to other accounts, other debts. The $200,000 was gone, and so was any hope of a return on our investment. It was all a lie. He had taken our money, our futures, our trust, and gambled it away. The contract, which we had signed with such innocent optimism, was his shield, and our naivete was his weapon. The silence that followed that discovery was deafening. It was the sound of innocence shattered, of trust irrevocably broken. He hadn't just borrowed money, he had stolen it, using the sacred bonds of family as his personal ATM. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not the end. This was just the beginning of a very long, very cold reckoning. The cinematic facade of our perfect family life had cracked, revealing the rot beneath, and I was left standing in the wreckage with nothing but a burning need to understand the full extent of his deception and to make him pay. The humidor felt cold in my hands, its polished surface a mockery of the truth it concealed. The ledger was thin, brittle with age, its pages filled with a spidery, hurried script that spoke of desperation, not ambition. For hours I sat there, the scent of stale cigar smoke clinging to the air, piecing together my father's elaborate charade. It wasn't just the $200,000. That was merely the tip of an iceberg he'd been slowly sinking for years. The ledger detailed a labyrinth of debts, loans from shady individuals with ominous names, and payments made to offshore accounts. There were entries that made my stomach churn, referencing payments to lawyers I'd never heard of, and others that seemed to denote hush money. He hadn't just invested our money, he'd used it as a down payment on his own undoing, a desperate attempt to stave off a collapse that had been brewing long before he'd pitched his grand business idea to us. My initial shock, the searing humiliation,
began to transmute into something harder, something sharper. It was a cold, clear rage that settled deep in my bones. The way he'd looked at me, at all of us, the day he'd presented his pitch, his eyes alight with that deceptive fire, it was a performance, a meticulously crafted lie designed to exploit our faith in him. He'd painted a picture of shared success, of building a legacy, when all along he was just trying to keep his head above water. The family duty was a cleverly disguised plea for bail money. The terms of the contract, which Mark had unearthed, suddenly made a sickening kind of sense. It wasn't just about him retaining control. It was about ensuring he had a legal claim to any potential recovery, a way to recoup his losses by using our capital as collateral against his creditors. He hadn't planned on sharing success. He'd planned on defaulting on his debts, leaving us holding the bag, and then perhaps using whatever remained of our initial investment to try and salvage something for himself. The weight of it all was crushing. My siblings, bless their hopeful hearts, were still operating under the delusion that this was a temporary setback, that Dad would somehow pull through. Mark was the most concerned, his pragmatic mind already wrestling with the legal implications, the potential for financial ruin if things truly unraveled. Sarah, ever the optimist, kept trying to find the silver lining, suggesting Dad might have a secret benefactor, a silent partner who could inject new funds. Mikey, still largely in the dark, just seemed confused and hurt by his father's evasiveness. They deserved to know. They deserved the unvarnished truth, not that carefully curated version our father had been feeding them. I didn't confront Dad directly, not yet. The ledger had shown me more than just his financial duplicity. It had revealed his network. The names, the dates, the cryptic notations pointed to a life lived in the shadows, far beyond the polished veneer of our Hamptons estate.
There were mentions of a discreet law firm, one I didn't recognize, specializing in distressed assets and discreet settlements. It was a world away from our father's usual circles of investment bankers and reputable attorneys. This was the underbelly, the place where reputations were salvaged or buried for a price. Driven by a gnawing curiosity and a growing sense of dread, I began to delve deeper, using my business school skills for a purpose I never envisioned. I leveraged connections, hired a discreet private investigator, a former colleague's father who owed me a favor, and had a reputation for being thorough and, more importantly, silent. I wanted to know who these people were, what kind of deals my father was involved in. I needed to understand the true nature of his empire, not the one he showed us, but the one he was actively trying to keep hidden. The investigator's report landed on my desk 2 weeks later, a thick, unassuming manila envelope. It confirmed my worst fears and then some. My father's legitimate business dealings, the ones that funded our opulent lifestyle, were not as robust as they appeared. They were propped up by a series of high-risk, high-yield investments that had, in recent years, begun to sour. The $200,000 from us was a desperate Hail Mary, a way to cover a margin call on one of those failing investments, the ledger's entries meticulously detailing the transfer of funds to a specific holding company I'd never heard of. The firm my father was secretly dealing with, the one from the ledger, was a notorious outfit known for its aggressive debt collection tactics and its ability to arrange complex restructuring deals, often at the expense of unsecured creditors, which, it turned out, we were about to become. The report also revealed another layer of deception. My father wasn't just an entrepreneur. He was a significant player in a network of shell corporations and offshore accounts, a sophisticated money laundering operation subtly disguised as legitimate trading entities. The business he'd pitched to us was a phantom, a smokescreen to justify borrowing funds that he was then using to service other, far more illicit financial obligations. He wasn't just in debt. He was involved in something far more dangerous, something that could have far-reaching consequences for all of us. The humiliation I'd felt was nothing compared to the sickness that now coursed through me. My father, the man who had lectured us on integrity and success, was a criminal. The report detailed meetings my father had with a man named Julian Thorne, the head of that discreet law firm. Thorne was described as a man who specialized in disappearing assets and leveraging familial obligations. Their meetings weren't just about debt restructuring, they were about asset protection, about shielding assets from potential litigation, and, more disturbingly, from the very family members who had unknowingly funded his downfall. Thorne's name appeared repeatedly in connection with my father's offshore accounts. The contract we'd signed, the one that seemed so innocuous at first glance, was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering, designed by Thorne, no doubt, to ensure that in any scenario, my father's liabilities would be minimized and our investment would be the first thing to go. This was it. This was the tipping point. The quiet fury I'd been nurturing ignited into a cold, calculating resolve. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a witness, and I had proof. The ledger, the investigator's report, the meticulously cross-referenced financial data, it all painted a damning picture. I knew I couldn't go to the authorities immediately. The legal ramifications for my father, and by extension our family name, would be catastrophic. But I also knew I couldn't let him get away with this. He had gambled with our futures, with our trust, and he had lost. My first move was subtle, almost invisible. I reached out to Thorne's firm, posing as a representative of a potential investor looking to acquire distressed assets. I used a burner phone and a fabricated email address, carefully crafted to sound legitimate. I requested a brief consultation to discuss synergies and opportunities for strategic acquisition. I knew Thorne would be intrigued. His business thrived on desperation, and I was about to present him with a potential new client in dire straits. The meeting was set for a sterile glass and chrome office downtown, miles from the opulent Hampton setting we were accustomed to. Thorne was exactly as described: sharp suit, colder eyes, a smile that didn't quite reach them. He exuded an aura of calm, professional menace. He listened intently as I spun my fabricated tale of a struggling business, of mounting debts, of the need for a swift, discreet solution. I mentioned my father's name obliquely, framing it as a tangential connection, a warning about the treacherous waters of high-stakes finance. I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a subtle shift in his posture. He knew my father. He knew the situation. "Your father," Thorne said, his voice smooth like polished stone, "is a complex individual. He's had a few challenges recently." I feigned ignorance, playing the role of the naive but desperate heir. Challenges? He always presented himself as so successful. Thorne chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Success is often a matter of perception, my dear, and managing perception requires resources that are not always readily available through conventional channels. He leaned forward, his gaze pinning me. "You mentioned a potential acquisition. What exactly are you hoping to achieve?" This was my opening. I didn't reveal what I knew, not yet. Instead, I began to subtly probe, to lay the groundwork for what was to come. I spoke of liquidating assets, of restructuring debt, of minimizing exposure. I peppered my conversation with terms I'd gleaned from my own research and from the investigator's report, terms related to offshore holdings, asset protection trusts, and clawback provisions. Thorne listened, his interest piqued. He clearly saw a new, potentially lucrative client. "You seem remarkably well informed for someone facing such difficulties," Thorne observed, a hint of suspicion creeping into his tone. "I've learned a great deal from my father," I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth, "and from observing the consequences when those lessons aren't fully heeded." The meeting concluded with Thorne agreeing to review my fabricated financial profile. He promised a preliminary assessment within 48 hours. As I walked out, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and revulsion. I was playing a dangerous game, dancing with wolves. But I was also learning, gathering intelligence, and, most importantly, making him aware that someone new was in play, someone who understood his world. The real shockwave, however, came not from Thorne, but from an unexpected source. A few days later, while sifting through more of my father's personal effects, I found a hidden compartment in his antique desk. Inside wasn't another ledger, but a collection of letters. Love letters, some of them, penned in my father's hand, addressed to a woman I didn't know. But it was the other letters, the ones tucked beneath, that sent a tremor through me. They were from a different law firm, a much more established and respected one, dated years ago. They detailed the terms of a prenuptial agreement my mother had signed. It was ironclad. In the event of a divorce or his death, she would receive a surprisingly modest settlement, almost as if he had anticipated a future where his vast fortune might not be as substantial as he presented it. This changed everything. My mother, the elegant, poised matriarch who had always seemed so secure, had been quietly and strategically protected, while he had systematically dismantled the financial future of his own children. The $200,000 wasn't just about his debts. It was about ensuring his own personal wealth remained insulated, while our contributions were swallowed by his reckless gambles. The man had meticulously planned his escape, his financial albatrosses carefully positioned to weigh down everyone but himself and his wife. The realization was a gut punch. He hadn't just betrayed us, he had orchestrated a betrayal, a long-term plan to safeguard his own interests at our expense. My father's business partner, a man named Robert Sterling, was a name that appeared sporadically in the investigator's report, mostly in connection with joint ventures that had turned sour. Sterling was a ghost, a man who operated in the background, an enabler. He was the steady hand, the one who supposedly provided the capital and the stability while my father provided the vision. I decided to approach Sterling next.
He was still involved in some of my father's remaining legitimate enterprises, a sort of silent guardian of the family legacy, or what was left of it. I arranged a meeting at a discreet country club, the kind where deals were made over expensive scotch and hushed conversations. Sterling was a polar opposite to Thorne, portly, affable, with a carefully cultivated air of weary respectability. He greeted me warmly, as if I were just another interested family member. He spoke of my father with a mixture of admiration and frustration. "Your father," Sterling began, swirling his amber liquid, "was a force of nature. Brilliant, ambitious, but sometimes impulsive. He always aimed for the stars, sometimes forgetting to check if the parachute was packed." I let him talk, nodding along, waiting for my moment. "He certainly seemed to be taking on a lot lately," I steered the conversation. "The new venture, for instance. We were all quite excited about it." Sterling's smile faltered. He looked around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Ah, yes, that. Look, your father, he has a way of making things sound grander than they are. That particular venture, it was more of a personal project. A necessary distraction, perhaps." "A distraction from what?" I pressed, my voice low. He sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. "From the mess he'd made elsewhere. I tried to warn him, told him to cut his losses, to consolidate, but he was always chasing the next big score. He borrowed heavily, invested aggressively, and when things didn't pan out, well, he got into some rather difficult situations." He paused, his gaze distant. "He used unconventional methods to secure funding, methods that skirted the edges of legality." My heart pounded. "Unconventional methods? Like the $200,000 from us?" Sterling's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked. "He told you that was an investment?" "Oh, dear. That wasn't an investment. Not in the way you're thinking. That was collateral, to secure a short-term loan from a rather unsavory party. He promised them a significant return, guaranteed by your collective stake. A gamble, plain and simple. A gamble he was always destined to lose. The betrayal was a physical blow. It wasn't just that he'd taken our money. It was that he'd used it as a pawn in a high-stakes game with dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to collect their dues, and not in cash." Sterling continued, his voice heavy with resignation. "He owed a lot of people a lot of money, more than I could ever help him manage. He brought in some specialists to handle it. Thorne's firm. They assured him they could protect his assets, shield him from the worst of it. But there's always a price, and that price, usually, is paid by those closest to you." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a weariness that mirrored my own. "He structured things very carefully. That contract you all signed? Thorne drafted it."
It essentially gave your father control over the funds until certain loan obligations were met. If they weren't met, the funds were forfeit to the lenders and to Thorne's firm for their services. I felt a cold dread wash over me. The contract wasn't just a loan agreement, it was a trap, expertly laid. My father hadn't just borrowed our money, he leveraged it, gambled it away, and then handed the reins to a firm that specialized in stripping assets. Sterling, it seemed, was aware of the true extent of the deception, but was either unwilling or unable to intervene. He was complicit by his silence, another cog in my father's destructive machinery. As Sterling spoke, the full scope of my father's perfidy began to crystallize. He hadn't just been trying to save his business, he had been actively engaged in a complex financial maneuver designed to protect his personal wealth and his marriage while sacrificing his children's futures. The prenuptial agreement, the loan from dangerous individuals, the sophisticated legal maneuvers by Thorne's firm, it all pointed to a chillingly deliberate plan. He had used our trust, our youthful optimism, as the currency to pay for his own survival and potentially for his own escape. The humiliation I'd felt initially was now overshadowed by a profound sense of anger and a chilling clarity. I wasn't just a naive victim, I was a pawn in a game I was only just beginning to understand. My father had set us up, not just for financial loss, but for a confrontation with the very people he'd indebted himself to, and he had placed my mother in a position of shielded ignorance, leaving us, his children, to face the fallout. I left the country club with a grim determination. The pieces were all there: the ledger, the investigator's report, the knowledge of Thorne's involvement, and Sterling's damning confession. My father had used our money as collateral for a loan from dangerous people and then handed over control of our investment to Thorne's firm as part of a desperate asset protection scheme, all while ensuring my mother's financial security remained untouched. He had played us all, pitting us against each other, against his creditors, and against the legal system itself. The cinematic facade of our family had crumbled, revealing a dark, complex underbelly. My father was not the benevolent patriarch we believed him to be, but a man driven by a desperate need to survive, willing to sacrifice everything and everyone in his path. The silence that had once felt like shame was now a breeding ground for a cold, calculated fury. I knew I couldn't go to the authorities yet. The implications were too vast, too messy. But I could no longer stand by and watch. The game had changed. I was no longer playing defense. It was time to make my father and the architects of his deception understand the true cost of their betrayal.
The cliffhanger was not in the uncertainty of what would happen next, but in the terrifying, exhilarating certainty of what I was about to do. The quiet storm within me had finally broken, and the deluge was about to begin. The Hamptons estate was eerily silent, a mausoleum of unspoken resentments and fractured trust. Sunlight, once a symbol of our family's golden era, now felt like an accusation, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the vast, empty halls. My siblings were gone, dispersed back to their lives, their faith in our father chipped but not yet shattered. They still clung to the hope of a miraculous recovery, a paternal save. I, however, had seen the ledger, heard Sterling's wary admission, and felt the icy logic of Thorne's machinations. My father wasn't just in financial trouble. He was a puppet master whose strings had snapped, leaving him entangled with predators he'd underestimated. The $200,000 wasn't just an investment. It was a down payment on his obsolescence, a desperate bid to buy time. Sterling's words echoed in my mind. Collateral, unsavory party, gamble he was always destined to lose. He'd used our collective future as a chip in a poker game he was rigged to lose, all to protect his own skin, and it seemed, my mother's meticulously guarded nest egg. The irony was a bitter pill. The woman he swore to protect had indirectly funded the ruin of the children he ostensibly worked for. My mother, blissfully unaware, floated through the house in her cashmere and pearls, a gilded bird in a gilded cage, insulated by a prenup that was both her salvation and our damnation. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the old house was my father shuffling papers, every shadow a creditor lurking. The weight of the truth was a physical burden, pressing down on my chest. But beneath the dread, something new was taking root, a cold, hard resolve. The humiliation had burned away, replaced by a scalpel-sharp focus. I wasn't going to be a casualty in my father's financial war. I was going to orchestrate the endgame. My first move was not confrontational. Not yet. Confrontation was messy, prone to emotional outbursts, the kind of chaos my father thrived in, the kind that allowed him to spin narratives. I needed precision. I needed to dismantle his carefully constructed edifice from the inside out. I remembered Thorne's dismissive tone, his veiled threat about leveraging familial obligations. He saw us as pawns. I intended to become the queen. I contacted Thorne again, this time under a different pretense. I used a secure, anonymized communication channel, the kind Sterling had alluded to when discussing my father's unconventional methods. I didn't mention Sterling or the $200,000 directly. Instead, I presented myself as a representative for a consortium of international investors interested in acquiring distressed assets, specifically those entangled with Thorne's firm.
I painted a picture of a vast, discrete network, eager to absorb problematic portfolios for a significant profit, and, more importantly, eager to silence any lingering liabilities. We understand, my carefully crafted message stated, that certain arrangements can become burdensome. We specialize in providing clean exits, ensuring all parties are satisfied without unnecessary complications. The implication was clear. I was offering to buy his problematic debts, and by extension, his leverage over my father. Thorne responded quickly, his professional curiosity piqued. He saw another opportunity, another vessel to extract value from. We agreed to meet, not at his sterile office, but at a private club, exclusive and discreet, the kind of place where reputations were bought and sold in whispers. I arrived early, dressed impeccably, projecting an air of quiet authority.
My father had taught me how to play the game of appearances, and I was about to use those lessons against him. Thorne arrived, the same impassive mask in place. He greeted me with a polite nod, his eyes scanning me, trying to gauge my worth, my depth. "A pleasure to finally meet the principal," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Your message was intriguing." "The world of high finance is full of intriguing opportunities, Mr. Thorne," I replied, my voice steady, "especially for those who understand how to navigate its less public corridors." I let him lead the conversation, planting seeds of doubt, hinting at the vastness of my supposed investor's reach. I spoke of my father's situation only in abstract terms, as an example of a solvable problem. "We've observed similar scenarios," I said, my gaze meeting his. "Clients who leverage familial capital for speculative ventures. The outcome, as you know, can be precarious, especially when creditors become impatient." Thorne's professional facade faltered for a microsecond. He knew I was talking about my father. He knew I knew. "Your father is a man of considerable ambition," Thorne said carefully. "Sometimes ambition outstrips resources." "Indeed," I agreed, leaning forward. "And when resources are leveraged, especially familial ones, the consequences can be severe. We are interested in acquiring the debt portfolio associated with Mr. Father's last name. We are prepared to offer a generous settlement, provided it ensures a complete and final resolution for all parties involved." The word creditors hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He was accustomed to being the one dictating terms, the one holding the power. Now he was faced with an unknown entity, one that seemed to possess both the financial clout and the strategic acumen to bypass him. "And what exactly constitutes a complete and final resolution in your estimation?" Thorne asked, his tone sharpening. "It means," I stated, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "that no one connected to Mr.
Father's last name will ever have to worry about his financial entanglements again. It means all outstanding obligations are settled, all threats neutralized, and all associated assets are liquidated and transferred." I let that sink in, including the assets currently held in trust for his children. The mention of our trust funds, funds my father had so cavalierly gambled, seemed to surprise him. Thorne had likely viewed them as collateral, a source of funds to be depleted. My statement implied they were off limits, protected, and about to be claimed. "That trust is currently under management," Thorne said, his voice tight, "subject to existing agreements." "Agreements which my consortium is prepared to renegotiate," I countered smoothly. "We are not interested in protracted legal battles or messy clawbacks. We prefer a swift, clean transaction. We will assume the debt, settle with your clients, and in return, we expect clear title to all assets currently pledged, including the assets within the Father's last name Children's Trust, and naturally, a comprehensive release of all claims against Mr. Father's last name and his immediate family." The implication was that my consortium would essentially buy my father's debt, pay off his creditors, and then assume control of the assets he'd pledged, including ours. But the twist was that we, his children, would be the ones buying that debt, essentially reacquiring what was ours, but this time with Thorne and his predatory associates out of the picture. Thorne, the architect of the asset protection scheme, was about to find his carefully constructed web unwoven by the very people he'd sought to exploit. Thorne sat back, a flicker of genuine contemplation crossing his face. He understood the power play. I wasn't just offering him money, I was offering him an exit from a potentially volatile situation, an escape from the labyrinth my father had created. He stood to make a considerable sum, and more importantly, to remove himself from the equation before any official investigations or complications arose. "This is a significant proposal," Thorne said slowly. "It requires careful consideration." "Of course," I replied, standing. "We are prepared to move quickly. Time, as you know, is of the essence when dealing with distressed assets." I left him with my secure contact information, a ghost in the machine, ready to pull the strings. The waiting period was agonizing. Each day felt like an eternity. My siblings called, their voices laced with a growing unease. Sarah was starting to doubt the optimistic narrative. Mark was poring over financial statements, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mikey, bless his heart, just wanted things to go back to normal. I offered vague reassurances, enough to keep them from panicking, but not enough to give them false hope. Then an encrypted message arrived. Thorne had accepted. His firm would facilitate the transfer of debt, acting as an intermediary to ensure a smooth transition to my consortium. The terms were complex, detailing the settlement amounts for each of my father's creditors, a tidy sum that represented a fraction of what he'd originally borrowed, but a significant payout for the individuals he'd entangled himself with. Crucially, the agreement stipulated that upon full settlement, all claims against the father's last name, Children's Trust, would be voided. The real game, however, was about to begin. The acquisition of the debt portfolio was merely the prelude. My true objective was not to rescue my father, but to expose him, to dismantle the illusion he'd so painstakingly dealt, and to reclaim what was rightfully ours, not through negotiation, but through force of will. I summoned my siblings to the Hamptons estate. The air was thick with unspoken tension as they arrived, their faces a mixture of apprehension and weary hope. My father was conspicuously absent, having conveniently scheduled a business trip that coincided with my request. My mother, as always, was a picture of elegant detachment, presiding over the afternoon tea ceremony with a serene, if slightly vacant, smile. "I have something to tell you all," I began, my voice cutting through the strained pleasantries. I didn't preface it with apologies or emotional pleas. I presented it as a matter of fact. Our father's recent business venture was a catastrophic failure. He didn't just lose money, he jeopardized our entire inheritance. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Mark's jaw tightened. Mikey looked confused, his eyes darting between us. My mother merely stirred her tea, her expression unreadable. "The $200,000 we each contributed," I continued, my voice steady, "wasn't an investment. It was collateral. My father borrowed money from dangerous people, and when he couldn't repay, he used our collective stake as security." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah started to cry, quiet, heartbroken sobs. Mark sat forward, his eyes fixed on me, a dawning horror in their depths. "Collateral? He gambled our inheritance on a loan?" "Worse," I said, the word a cold blade. "He then entered into an elaborate asset protection scheme with a law firm called Thorne & Associates. This firm specializes in helping people like my father hide their assets and shield themselves from creditors, often at the expense of their own families." I laid out the facts, the chain of events, the calculated deception. I didn't shy away from the ugliness, the sordid details of debt, shady dealings, and legal manipulation. I explained Thorne's role, Sterling's complicity, and my mother's unwitting insulation. The picture I painted was one of a man utterly devoid of integrity, a man who had systematically planned his own escape at the cost of his children's futures. "But how do you know all this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I investigated," I said simply. "I hired someone. I found the ledger. I spoke with Robert Sterling, and I negotiated with Julian Thorne himself." Mark stared at me, his pragmatism battling with disbelief. "You negotiated with Thorne? What did you do?" "I made him an offer," I explained. "My consortium, a group of investors I've assembled, has acquired my father's debt. We've settled with his creditors, and in return for a significant payout, Thorne's firm has agreed to relinquish all claims on the assets that were pledged, including our trust funds." A wave of confusion washed over them. "So we're getting our money back?" Mikey asked, his eyes wide with a nascent hope. "Not exactly," I corrected. "My consortium has essentially bought back the debt. We've paid off the people my father owed, and now the assets that were pledged as collateral, including the funds in our trust accounts, are under our consortium's control." Mark frowned, a sharp edge to his confusion. "Our consortium? What does that mean?" "It means," I said, my gaze sweeping across their stunned faces, "that we, his children, are now the owners of the debt my father incurred, and as the owners of that debt, we now have control over the assets he pledged to secure it, the assets that were originally ours." The realization dawned, slow and brutal. They hadn't just gotten their money back, they had effectively bought their inheritance from the clutches of predators, and in doing so, had taken control. My father, the man who had built his empire on leverage and deception, had inadvertently handed the ultimate leverage to his own children. "So we own the debt?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of a dawning, complex relief. "We do," I confirmed, "and as the holders of that debt, we can choose what to do with it. We can forgive it, we can collect on it, we can leverage it." I looked directly at my father's empty chair.
We can ensure that the man who gambled away our futures understands the true cost of his actions. My mother, for the first time, looked truly shaken, her porcelain composure cracked. What does this mean, dear? For your father? I met her gaze, my expression unyielding. It means he has no more assets to protect. His creditors are satisfied, his debts are settled, and the people who once held his leverage now hold nothing. He is, in essence, financially neutered. Mark finally understood. His face, usually etched with concern, was now a mask of grim satisfaction. You mean, we have him. We can do whatever we want. We have the power, I corrected, but the subtext was clear. We had the leverage. We held the strings. My father, the master manipulator, was now the pawn. The final confrontation, if it could be called that, was not a shouting match. It was a chilling, almost surgical detachment. My father returned a few days later, basking in his fabricated success, oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred. He called me into his study, the air thick with the scent of expensive leather and self-delusion. "So, my dear," he began, a practiced smile on his lips, "I hear you've been handling some of our family's financial affairs. Excellent. That's what I wanted to see. A sense of responsibility." I sat opposite him, calm and collected. "Yes, Father, I've been handling our affairs." He launched into a patronizing monologue about financial prudence, about the importance of sound investments, about how he'd always intended for us to be involved. He spoke of future ventures, of opportunities he was pursuing. "And what about the money, Father?" I asked, my voice deceptively soft. "The $200,000? The trust funds? What was the plan for those?" His smile faltered. He shifted in his seat. "Ah, yes, a temporary reallocation, a necessary measure to secure a bridge loan. It was always meant to be a short-term solution. Things have been resolved." "Resolved by whom?" I pressed. "By me, of course," he said, puffing out his chest. "I've always been able to find a way." "No, Father," I said, my voice hardening. "Resolved by me. My consortium acquired your debt. I settled with your creditors. I paid off Thorne and his associates." His eyes whitened. The color drained from his face. He stammered. You did what?" "I took control," I said, leaning forward, my gaze locking with his. "You gambled with our future, Father. You used our inheritance as collateral for your own desperate gambles. You lied, you deceived, you manipulated. You thought you were so clever, hiding your assets, protecting yourself. But you forgot about the leverage you were giving me." I let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating. He stared at me, the bravado gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He understood. Finally, the game was over. He had no power, no assets, no recourse. What happens now?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Now," I said, the words falling like ice, "we decide. We, your children, the ones you so carelessly betrayed. We decide what happens to the debt you owe. We decide what happens to the assets you pledged. You built your life on lies, Father, and now those lies have finally caught up to you. You are no longer the patriarch. You are a debtor, and we are the creditors." I stood up, the cinematic drama of his downfall unfolding before me in the quiet, suffocating luxury of his study. There was no catharsis, no triumphant shout, just a profound, hollow victory. The humiliation was gone, the silence broken, the control seized. The revenge wasn't in inflicting pain, but in holding him accountable, in stripping away his illusion of power, and in reclaiming our own futures, piece by painstaking piece. The air in the room, once filled with his arrogance, now felt cold, empty, and irrevocably broken. It was the sound of a kingdom, built on sand and lies, finally succumbing to the tide.